pray, Father, that you'd help us that we might learn and be encouraged from the things that we study today. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay. Just as I usually do, try to catch us up on what we did last week with a brief overview in the first couple of chapters. We talked about how Esther is really sandwiched in between the things we've already been studying, and it goes chronologically in between the two sections of Ezra, where Ezra accounts first the first return under Zerubbabel, and then he talks about his return that he led, beginning in chapter 7. And there's a big gap there, and Esther kind of fills that gap. We talked about it again. The constant theme of all of these lessons we're studying is that God is in control. God is going to keep His promises, and despite when things look their darkest, God is still working through His plan, and God's people can trust in Him. And this is particularly in this time of preservation, as we called it under Esther. He's preserving His people, that they might not be stamped out as this Haman's plot was what learn about attempted to do. All these take place in the capital of Susa, and they're under the reign of a man who's called Ahasuerus in the Bible. His Greek name is a lot more familiar to historians of Xerxes, but the Hebrew Ahasuerus is just a transliteration of his Persian name, and this is where the story of Esther falls under his reign. We talked a little bit about the background of Esther and its purpose, and certainly we'll, Lord willing, talk a good bit about this. Chapter 4 really brings out the purpose of God's providence and the belief that His people had that God would take care of them, and to see some differences in just the worldview and the culture of the pagan people in which they lived in Persia, and the Jewish people and their view of fate and omens and pagan practices versus God's sovereignty and belief the Jews had in His protection. And to see just how rewarding it is to trust in God and to really not despair when things are difficult, but to still see God's plan working through us. And then the book ends with the Feast of Purim, and you see some of the purpose there to show how that all came about. Last week we covered the first two chapters, and we saw what author appears to be contrasting the opulence, the grandeur, and the riches and power of the Persian Empire, but at the same time, this king who's powerless to get his wife to come to the feast, to the party that he's given. And you see the greatness of this emperor, but at the same time, he's really not very smart, and his advisors are not very smart, and turns what seems like a domestic squabble into an empire emergency, the way they respond to it. And has Vashti deposed because she would not come before the king. And just note, we'll see the kind of contrast in that, and that because she would not come before the king, she was removed. Now, in our lesson, Esther is going to be at risk if she does come before the king. And so kind of a reverse of the hazard there. And then Chapter 2, the last part of review, is just how they then decided to replace the queen, and search was made, and we're introduced to Mordecai, who's raising his cousin Esther, who's been orphaned, and she is one of those chosen to be brought before the king, and she, above all the maidens, finds favor with him, and she selected the new queen. And the book, the chapter closes with Mordecai discovering a plot to assassinate King Xerxes, and relaying that information. The king is saved, and the potential assassins are executed, and that's all written down in the records of the king. But that's the way the chapter ends. Just a couple of reminders of just some comments that we talked about last week. There is definitely not a mention of God, but it's seems like this is done for effect by the way the writer is very masterful way he tells the story, but it seems to be a careful avoidance of this explicit reference to God, but it serves the purpose of helping us see situation to us when God seems least visible to us, and we're tempted to think he doesn't care, that this particular book can be solace to us and seeing application that he surely is at work, even though we don't see him. And this is probably more close to our modern day experience of providence, of not having all the answers, and God's not parting the Red Sea for us and so forth, but that we can be assured that he's still going to be with us. This Firth makes this point, not only fails to mention God at all, but it seems to go out of its way to avoid any obviously religious language. It has a developed theology, he says, but it's a theology which operates precisely because it does not mention God directly. And then this final one, this kind of tees up to what we're going to transition in chapter 3. That at the close of chapter 2, things are all working according to God's plan, but no one really knows it at this point. He makes the point that at this close of chapter 2, Esther has been introduced. She's the new queen. Mordecai has a place of high standing, and he's actually done this thing to deliver the king, and it's been written down. But all this reflection about Xerxes and his great power, and we'll see Haman and his lust for power, they're really powerless to stop the sovereign will of God, and events are going to unfold that they're powerless to stop. And that's all kind of foreshadowed, and we don't see that, but we know looking back how this was all in place and going to eventually work out for the good. So get into the chapters 3 then, because the story does take a threatening turn with the introduction that we have to of Haman and of all his plans and so forth that he had. There's not we're not really saying that he's the only villain, but I'm calling him the main villain. Introduced Xerxes certainly is palpable, and he's the one who really has the power, but he seems to be a man who's very pliable, very easily influenced. We saw that where his advisors told him how to react when his wife would not come to the feast, and then they told him how he needed to pick a new queen and how he ought to do it. It almost like if he had to decide what he's going to have for breakfast, he had to call his 7 advisors to get help, because he didn't seem to be very one to make decisions on his own. And Haman now we're introduced to him, and it mentions at the beginning in verse 1 that Haman is promoted, and I think that was one of the questions in our book. How was he exalted, or what was the position that Haman was given? And it's not officially named, but he's basically placed above all the other nobles in the kingdom, except the king, obviously. So he would be put in a place of honor that's second only to the king. Let's just read the first 6 verses of chapter 3 as we get into these events. Esther 3, verse 1. After these events, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and established his authority over all the princes who were with him. All the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why are you transgressing the king's command?" Now it was when they had spoken daily to him, and he would not listen to them, that they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's reason would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage to him, Haman was filled with rage, but he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for he had told him who the people of Mordecai were. Therefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. We see the kind of the plot thickens, so to speak, and Haman now in this position of power. It said the king had commanded him that people would bow down to them. And just a couple of things to notice: this command that they bow down before him. It almost seems like it ought to be unnecessary, but it mentions the fact that it was the king's command that he would bow down before him. And it's almost like maybe people didn't feel like he was very noble or very worthy of bowing down, but he had made this command that you will bow down to him. But we're left to ponder exactly why he was promoted. It's really not really said, and it's almost, if you look at the way the chapter 2 ends and chapter 3 begins, there's this time gap of almost 5 years, 4 years, and so many months that has happened between chapter 2 when Esther becomes queen, and in chapter 3 it mentions this is now the 12th year of Ahasuerus, and 3 and verse 7. So the chapter 2 kind of closes in a sort of unsatisfying way, and that it mentions that Mordecai had saved the king, and that was written down, but nothing is ever said about getting any reward for that. And it seems like this now the way that transition into chapter 3, that the writer tells the story this way for effect, to say, okay, you're anticipating what's going to happen good to Mordecai, but instead Haman's promoted instead, without giving really the reason for his promotion. All of us who've worked in organizations probably know that feeling when you think you've done a really good job, but nobody really notices, and then somebody else gets the praise or whatever. Maybe that's the intention of the author telling it this way, but instead of anything happening good to Mordecai, at least right at this time, instead it happens to King Haman. And I thought it just good to kind of think about how that compared to Joseph. Remember when Joseph was in the dungeon, and he had been so good to every turn wherever he was in the dungeon, he'd put over the prisoners, and he told the dreams of the cupbearer and the baker, and he told the cupbearer, "You're going to go be returned back to your position. Don't forget about me, and speak to Pharaoh about me, because I don't deserve to be here." And the Bible says he was delivered, but he completely forgot about it. And so Joseph is waiting for some good thing to happen, and he's there, it says, for 2 more years, I think, 2 or 3 years before there's any recognition, and Joseph is brought out. And Mordecai here's waiting. Nothing seems to have happened other than this just is written down. But we'll see something does happen. And then one other point here from verse 1 is Haman is described, at least his father, as an Agagite, and there's some disagreement if you read different commentators whether Agag was a city in the Persian Empire, or it goes back to Agag, who was an Amalekite, the king of the Amalekites. Most people tend to think that this is woven in the story for a reason, that he was a descendant of the Amalekites. Remember in 1 Samuel 15, where Saul was told to utterly destroy the Amalekites because they had attacked Israel as they came out of Egypt, and God was going to have vengeance on them. The Agagites, Agag was spared at that time. Eventually, Samuel put him to death. But we can read of other Amalekites later on in Israel's history, so obviously they weren't wiped out. And many people think that this is some of the reason why Mordecai would not bow down to him. If you look at the kind of the family tree, Agag was an Amalekite, and from his descent, if Haman came from that, then Mordecai was a Benjamite who would come from Saul, and his family as one from Benjamin descended from King Saul, who really has basically met his demise by failing to kill Agag. There's been some animosity between them for some time. So that's possibly part of the reason for the response and not wanting to bow down. But let's look then at the officials bow down and pay homage except Mordecai. And the book asks us to think about why it was that he didn't bow down. And it really doesn't say, if you look at the footnote on page 45, that it makes the point that bowing before a king was not contrary to Jewish law or practice, and there's several examples given there. But I think probably most likely the explanation is what he gives there in that footnote on page 45 is this bowing was not just showing homage to someone's exalted position above them as their king, but it was meant to be a type of emperor worship, or showing them accepting that as worship, not just as paying homage as though they were a god on earth. And that, to me, seemed like the most likely reason that Mordecai did not bow down. But some people put it back to this family tree because of the enmity with the Amalekites. It goes back a long way. It's interesting to note, though, when it talks about all the officials bowed down except Mordecai, Mordecai neither bowed down or paid homage. In verse 2, he must then, because he's included in that group, been one of the royal officials as well. And reference is made multiple times to him sitting at the king's gate, where most of the officials did their judging and business and things as part of the royal court. And so we don't know exactly what Mordecai's position was, but he's part of these royal servants of the king, and he is called out as though as one who does not bow down. So these others in verses 3 and 4 question him and say, "Why are you not bowing down?" And they decide that they're going to tell the king and see how this all turns out. They saw this as pretty serious violation of what the king had said, and Mordecai basically is not going to change. Over and over again, day after day, they're reminding him and asking him for a reason, and all he seems to reply is that I'm a Jew, and that probably is going back to the idea that Jews could not worship someone else as though they were deity, and that's the reason that he gives for that. That's the most likely reason. But Haman, after he had been coming and going and not been bowed down, apparently had not noticed initially, but when he does notice, it's said he was filled with rage, for verse 5, after they came and told him about that. But it gives you an idea of kind of the vanity of Haman, and that he's, how dare you not bow down before me, and felt like he was being disrespected. But he is so filled with pride that he thinks it's not enough just to wipe this guy out. I'm going to take vengeance on the entire people of the Jews, because apparently in this dialogue with the other officials, they said, hey, the reason he's not doing that is because the Jews can't bow down to you and worship. And he said, well, basically in his mind, I'm going to take care of all the Jews then. That's the way he's going to get his spite. And so he begins trying to devise a way to make all that happen. And that's interesting to see kind of how this plays out. So let's read the rest of the chapter, beginning in verse 7 of chapter 3. In the first month, which is the month Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, Pur, that is the lot, was cast before Haman from day to day and from month to month, until the 12th month, that is the month Adar. Then Haman said to Ahasuerus, there's a certain people scattered and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of all other people, and they do not observe the king's laws, so it is not in the king's interest to let them remain. If it is pleasing to the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who carry on the king's business to put in the king's treasuries." Then the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and the enemy of the Jews. The king said to Haman, "The silver is yours, and the people also. Do with them as you please." Then the king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month, and it was written just as Haman commanded, to the king's satraps, to the governors who were over each province, to the princes of each people, each province according to its script, each people according to its language, being written in the name of King Ahasuerus, sealed with the king's signet ring. Letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, and to seize their possessions as plunder. A copy of the edict to be issued as law in every province was published to all the people, so that they should be ready for this day. The couriers went out impelled by the king's command while the decree was issued at the citadel in Susa. And while the king and Haman sat down to drink, the city of Susa was in confusion. So we see now this plot begins to be devised by Haman, and Haman, because of his understanding of omens and fate and so forth, is not going to just pick any day that he's going to do this. He wants to find a favorable day, his lucky day, that he'll be blessed by the gods and so forth. And so how is he going to figure that out? Do their gods speak to them like Jehovah God did to the Israelites? They had these things that are little pebbles or broken stone that they use like dice, and they were the type of lot that was used. And the word pure is describes the lot that they would cast, and it just says that in the first month the lot was cast. Verse 7 doesn't say who did the casting, but the they must refer to the Persian astrologers and magicians who typically use those things. This word pur is not the Hebrew word for lot. It's actually, I think, an incorrect footnote on number 2 on page 45. The Hebrew word for lot is a different Hebrew word, but this is actually a transliteration type of the Babylonian word that was used for lot, that meant lot, and it also is the singular form. And like a lot of Hebrew words, you make the plural by making the im. So the purim is plural. Pur is one lot. Purim is multiple lots. And so that's really the origin of the word. And there's a lot of other historians that mention this Persian custom of determining the best time to attack and do different things in their kingdom. There's actually a reference, if you want to look at Ezekiel 21:21, Babylonian times, where they were trying to decide the best time to attack Jerusalem. And Ezekiel talks about how the king of Babylon is sacrificing these animals and reading the liver of the animals and trying to find the omen of the best time and which battle strategy to use and so forth. That was in the Eastern religion, except for the Jews' religion. That was very common. You would think when he's casting these lots or dice, and they're using some type of a calendar, and they keep casting it until it falls on this 13th day of the 12th month. You think he would go, oh man, that's a long way off. It's 11 months from now. But he was dedicated to these fates and omens and was not going to act until he was blessed by their pagan gods. And so, in a way, author, I think, calls that out in one of the questions that there really gives time for the Jews to give a response. And this question number 6, he said, see Proverbs 16:33, which basically says the decision of the lot is from the Lord, and that God is going to control things when people are trying to make a decision that He's at least cares about and involved in. He can make the lot come out however He wants to. This gives the Jews obviously time for a counter strategy for what's going to take place, rather than this going to happen the next day. It's 11 months out with the way that date works out. I think you can again see God's providence working there. So he's decided on what he wants to do and decided on a date that he wants to do it, but he can't just go do it without the king's backing. But the king's not really hard to convince. I described him as kind of a pliable king. So he goes in before the people, as we read in verse 8. He uses the term "a certain people." He doesn't even really name who this certain people is, but he builds his case with this kind of mix of truths and half-truths and outright lies about the Israelites. And there's some things that he mentions, like saying they are scattered and dispersed in your kingdom. That's true. I mean, there certainly had been spread throughout Persia. Some people say this scattered and dispersed is, again, a kind of an accusation in that they are isolated or unassimilated. They aren't like the rest of us. They're dispersed or not blending in with the rest of us, which certainly is true, and the Jews were to be a special people. But these other accusations, like their laws are such that they can't obey our laws, is not really. They did have a religious law that they followed, but it didn't keep them from obeying the Persian laws as long as they didn't conflict with that. They were that was certainly an exaggeration, if not an outright lie. Just, think about Jesus when he was before the Roman authorities. They were basically saying, he was defying Roman law and trumping up ideas that he was trying to be a king when he told Pilate, I'm not a king on this earth. My kingdom is a different sort of kingdom. But the same sort of deal. They're using some sort of half-truths to trump up these charges against the Jews, and Haman is using that same strategy here. And so he requests, verse 9, that they be destroyed, and he essentially offers the bribe of 10,000 talents of silver, which is a huge sum of money. Some people calculate that would be more than half of the tax revenue of an entire year of the whole kingdom of Persia. Incredible amount. Whether that was hyperbole or not, it was enough to get the king's attention. He said there's no profit to let these people live in verse 8, but obviously you can see there's a profit if we kill all these people and take their money. And it's kind of the irony there that he can see profit to this terrible evil he's proposing. Most people think that he didn't have 10,000 talents sitting around in his bank account somewhere. He was probably thinking that if we take all these people and kill them, we'll take all their possessions and they will be worth a large amount of money. And what we gain is plunder. I'll at least take 10,000 of it and give it back to the king's treasury. And there's this conversation back and forth between the king and Haman, and it almost sounds like the king says, "No, you keep the money." But later on, we can see from the conversation that Mordecai has, and that Esther talks about being sold. My people were being sold for money. That there really was an agreement. Some people say this is kind of the Near Eastern custom of saying, "Oh, no, you take it. No, I'll take it," and back and forth. You remember when Abraham was trying to buy a plot of land to bury Sarah, and Ephron was the man that owned the part of the land. He said, "No, what is a plot of land that's worth 300 talents between me and you?" And basically he's naming his price, but almost saying, "I'll give it to you." That's probably what's going on here, is that they're bartering back and forth. But eventually he removes his signet ring and basically gives him unlimited authority. He gave it to Haman, the enemy of the Jews. This is the first time this wording is used, but it's repeated several more times in the narrative. The king doesn't seem to even bother who this certain people is, asking him who he wants to have killed. But he basically says, you do with them as you please. Won't have time to look over, but chapter 9 and verse 5. Remember when we introduced the book, they talked about how things build up to a crisis, and then they go back and to a deliverance, and there's this chiastic structure in the book. If you look at chapter 9 and verse 5, it talks about how the Jews did as they pleased on this date to defend themselves when the tables were turned on the enemies of the Jews. That wording is repeated again, worth noting. So essentially a death warrant is written and sent out, and this elaborate description of how all the provinces were notified and all the things were written down. Is made official by writing down. And if you notice, when they're called together to write this down is the 13th day of the first month. And what happened on the 14th day of the first month on the Jewish calendar? It was the Feast of Passover. So just again, a contrast between this celebration they would be making of deliverance from Egyptian bondage. The day before that, they hear about this edict for their annihilation. In Persian, and they're living in Persia now, not in Egypt, but the contrast is pretty obvious there. And then again, the final contrast, the people are bewildered and the city is confused. And what do Haman and the king do? Said they go off and sit down and drink. That's how nonchalant or uncaring they seem to be about what they've stirred up. Is basically the king has allowed Haman to write out the entire people are going to be destroyed, commit genocide on a certain date, and they said, okay, let's go have a drink. And it's not a concern to them. The city, it seems to mention the whole city of Susa in verse 15 was in confusion, not just the Jews, because if such an arbitrary edict could be published by the king, you'd have to think, well, what else is he going to do? What if I anger him in some way? This is confusing to them. That doesn't seem like a very orderly way to run a kingdom. So, chapter 4 then, let's take the last 10 minutes to talk about what's really the most central part of the theme and where the providence is really brought out in chapter 4, and Esther is going to make a courageous decision. Mordecai and the Jews throughout Persia mourned greatly. This was, of course, common in the Near East as the very not hide one's grief. It was a very public mourning that was done, and it was common to wear sackcloth and go about with dirt on your head and be unkept and mourn very loudly. And this is certainly a very sad time. It's really the low point in the narrative. Basically, unless there's a deliverer comes up to rescue them, death seems certain for all the Jews. And definitely a shocking thing to hear when it goes to all the provinces and heralded and announced. It would cause great mourning, and mentions that it was basically this mourning was among all the Jews, verse 3 says, weeping and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. It's a very difficult time. Just think about Mordecai as he's grieving, thinking, okay, this all happened because I didn't bow down, and I told these people why I didn't bow down. And the thread continued, rather than just me being punished, all my people now are condemned. And he'd taken care, remember, to tell Esther, don't reveal that you're a Jew, and don't say that. But he had let it be known that he was a Jew, and now it may have magnified his grief by knowing that it's because of his word that this is not just he being condemned, but all his people. But there's no mention in our story of blaming Mordecai. He's the victim, not the one who's to be blamed for this. We know that no one mourning could enter in the king's gate, and that appears like they just didn't want anyone messing up with their party and showing sadness. Recall Nehemiah, how when he was sad before the king, he was greatly afraid when the king noticed that. And maybe a connection there, just a court custom that was common. Esther is shocked to hear of Mordecai's mourning, and he sends him clothes. That's her somewhat superficial way of patching things up, as not initially appears like understanding why he's mourning. It doesn't say that, verse 4, but from the ensuing dialogue we can be sure that she didn't know why he was mourning, and she just said, okay, I'll fix that. He doesn't have anything to wear but sackcloth today. I'll send him some clothes. And so again, she's not very bought in right at this point. She's just sending him something to put on. But then what's going to follow is 3 different stages of dialogue between Esther and Mordecai. Interesting, they never even see each other. It's all sent back and forth by this eunuch. Although they never speak directly, you can see intensifying language between the two and building commitment from Esther to do what she needs to do. So, in this first stage, in verses 5 through 9, and unfortunately we won't be able to read this in the text, but Esther basically is informed. She's given lots of information. Mordecai orders that she go before the king and beg his favor for her people. Now it's no longer, don't tell them who your people is. He wants her to reveal that she's a Jew and to go before him and beg for mercy. Notice how detailed Mordecai's explanation is. It talks about the very sum of money that was involved in the transaction. He sends her a copy of the decree. It seems like he really wants her convinced and bought in. He's asking for a huge commitment from her, and so he doesn't spare any detail. She understands that this is not just Mordecai's imagination, that this is a very real thing that was going to happen if she didn't intervene. This second stage is where Esther first is concerned about the risk involved with that. So Esther sends a message back and says, don't you know, all the people in the kingdom know that you can't go in before the king if you're not invited, that nothing awaits someone like that than death, except that the king can hold out his scepter. But she adds this little detail, and it's been 30 days since the king has sent for me. And not only is there this law about going in uninvited, that's something that Mordecai probably understood, but she said, it seems like, if you can read between the lines, I've kind of fallen out of favor. This was the guy who I was impressed so much, but now it's been 30 days since he sent for me. Of course, he had a harem and a polygamous type of king, but she was not very confident at this point. But Mordecai insists that he's confident that you see his belief in God's providence, that she cannot choose to remain silent and still do what God's plan was for her, the work that he wanted to go through her. So let's just read the verses 13 and 14, which are really probably the most famous verses in the whole book. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this. So basically, this is the real peak of commitment he's asking for her. He knew God's purposes would still be fulfilled if she didn't act, not entirely dependent on her, but perhaps that was her life purpose. And just the way he words it, who knows whether you've come into royalty for such a time as this. To me, we can make a very personal application. That's kind of in the real time, in the moment, when we are trying to think, what is God's will for me? What is God's purpose? We have to always say, who knows? Now, looking back, we can be like Joseph and other people and look back and see God's providence working in our lives. But in real time, it's really the exact same situation that Mordecai, who knows? And that's very telling. And this third stage, Esther is convinced, and she basically takes control in verses 15 through 17. Now, instead of Mordecai ordering her to go in, now Esther is giving orders to Mordecai. She asks for the spiritual support of her people with this 3-day fast. The fast for me, I think, again, deliberately avoids mentioning prayer, but mentions fasting. But almost always in the Bible, fasting and prayer go together. I think we have to read between the lines, and that's what she's asking for is spiritual support of all the Jews. She's asking Mordecai and ask all the Jews to pray and fast for me. And then she basically says, I will go to the king. She's made her decision. She wavered and started out very superficial in reaction to the whole crisis. Now she's bought in. And she's basically committing herself to God's will. If I perish, I perish. But if God is going to work through me, He will do that too. And that reminds me of the 3 young men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who told the king, I'm not going to bow down to the image. If God is willing, He can deliver us, but if not, we're still not going to bow down. That's basically the same posture now Esther is making. God could deliver her and she could be successful, but if that's God's will. But if I perish, I perish. And so Mordecai now goes away and carries out the instructions. So he's obedient to her, and he's obviously approving that she's made that decision. So, just some final words to think about this. This chapter is basically the punchline of the whole book about providence. But you expect God, if ever going to be mentioned, to be mentioned right here in verse 14. But this one commentator said, God is most present and most absent in this chapter. The book assumes God's activity evident in God-shaped holes in the narrative, is the way this guy put it. Is the silence is impossible to ignore. And then finally, Whitcomb makes this point: the promises of God, the justice of God, and the providence of God shine brilliantly through the entire crisis, so that the mere omission of His name obscures nothing of His identity, attributes, and purpose for His chosen people, the entire world of mankind. So now we'll see next week what happens when she does go before the king, and Esther exposes Haman for what he is. So we'll pick that up next week. Thank you very much.